Hello and welcome to the Sensibly Speaking podcast. This is Chris Shelton, the critical thinker at large, coming at you for another show of podcasting greatness on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, iHeartRadio, and with video here on YouTube. All right, guys, I'm here in the United States right now, obviously, as my listeners know, and we are just getting into the beginnings of dealing with COVID-19, the coronavirus. And I just wanted to put a couple words out here of a timely nature because we are recording this. This is going to go up in like a day or two of us doing this week. Sometimes I'm weeks in advance, and other times I'm right on right before it's about to go up. And in this case, I wanted to take advantage of that timeliness to point out to everybody who's listening to please, with whatever influence I have, with however many of you are out there, please go to the CDC, the WHO, the NHS, whatever your country's, actual official science websites are for this disease and what it's all about, this virus. This is not a joke. This is not just the flu. This is not just a thing, some passing fad. And I think pretty much most people outside of the United States get that, but I don't know that everybody in the United States does. And this is just one of those things where, yeah, it's going to be an inconvenience. It's going to be a problem. And but that's just kind of the nature of, a global pandemic. It can be a bit of an inconvenience for us. But if we want to survive it, then we need to pay attention and we need to have our head on straight and we need to be listening clearly to the instructions and guidelines and rules that are being set for us by people who actually understand the science. Don't pretend you have degrees you don't have or knowledge you don't have, or you just happen to listen to Sean Hannity and so you have a line in on the truth. Any more than listening to me is a line in on the truth. I'm telling you, go to the scientists and get their data. I'm not going to try to repeat it for you here. It's not my place, right? It's their job. It's what they do, and they communicate about this quite well. And one of the things I do want to point out, though, from my expertise is that something I've noticed that the epidemiologists, the epidemic people, the guys who really understand and study this stuff on a large scale over years and years and years and see how these things work, is they also understand the social psychology of how this stuff works. Because a lot of people in a calm, rational state where everything's chill or there's no immediate threat, believe that they will act a certain way when presented with emergency circumstances or a dire threat to their survival. And it turns out that we don't always act the way we think we will. And in fact, we often do exactly the opposite of what we think would be, in our calmer period, would be a nice, sensible, rational thing to do, and we end up doing crazy things. And you don't want to put yourself in that position, right? Social psychology is clear on this. Epidemics cause crazy behavior. And they take that into account when they're putting their instructions together and their guidelines together, so that it might not make total sense to you even to have to follow some of the rules, but they're there for your protection. And just really want to reiterate that you can get answers to any question you have if you dive and delve and look into it. None of this stuff is mysterious or unknowable or unlearnable. So do as many deep dives as you want. But I'm just please recommending, I don't want to see any of you guys suffer needlessly or die, as a result of this thing. And the fact of the matter is that people are going to die. And there's nothing we can do about stopping that, except follow these rules and guidelines that we are given to protect ourselves and protect the people around you. So that all being said, that's my soapbox for this. Now let's get back to our regularly scheduled programming. And on that note, I am welcoming back Jon Atack to continue with basically, we're in this big oral history of Scientology that we are doing on this channel. Jon is a major contributor and has given more information than I think any other single source for my channel, other than, say, L. Ron Hubbard directly. So, Jon, welcome back to the show.
Thank you. You'll forgive me if I don't shake your hand today.
Yes. Exactly. Okay, well, we're gonna pick back up, yeah? I mean, how are things going at your end? Any comments you want to contribute to that, or should we just get right to it?
No, I think it's eminently sensible. We need to have the real information. What's going to happen is, probably, according to the virologists who are talking about it, that we are dealing with a pandemic, but it's not. It need not be a panic, which is the first three letters and the last two letters of pandemic. If you notice, very curious that it needn't be a panic if we act relatively sensibly. Yes, it will pass through the population, but most people will just experience a kind of mild flu. For the elderly, we need to be especially careful to keep them isolated from this horrible disease. But I was saying before, the New Scientist magazine have a very good piece explaining, the realities of the situation.
Awesome.
We need to be informed, and that's what we both have spent so much of our time promoting to people. And we also are saying, we don't know about this. We aren't gurus. We're passing on information secondhand. Go to the source. Go to virologists and epidemiologists who know what they're talking about.
Exactly. Cool, man. Okay, well, let's pick up the thread where we left off. Now, in our last couple episodes, we've covered your history with Scientology. We have covered your involvement with the very roots of the independent free zone Scientology movement. Yes, with Captain Bill, and all the excitement we had in our last episode, covering some pretty grim details about that whole sordid history. So let's pick up where we left off there, and I think we're going to probably end up talking a lot of legal this podcast, because we're going to be getting into court cases. Let me begin by first saying I don't even know, with all the study I've done, the exact sequence of all the events through the 1980s, because I was in a very different headspace in the 1980s, and I wasn't tracking with any of this stuff. But a lot of things happened in Scientology, in and out of Scientology in the 80s. So, Jon, you were heavily involved in all of that. So where should we pick up?
Well, when I left in October 1983, the concern that many people had was that they had money on account in Scientology. And so one of the first things I helped to do is to set up a system where if you needed a repayment, then there was somebody you can go to, you get the forms, you fill it in, and do that. I don't know how many people went through that. We didn't charge any money for it, which was kind of stupid looking back, but I could have retired by now. But, there was some very small claims. What interests me in retrospect is that we were very happy to help somebody get a repayment of money on account. But initially, if somebody came and they wanted a refund of money, having had auditing or training, we still, at this point, believed. And so we wouldn't help them do that. And it's just a fascinating part of the programming, that if it didn't work, and if they didn't deliver what they promised, and as Ron Hubbard said, we always deliver what we promise. If you didn't actually achieve supernatural abilities and the ability to communicate freely with anyone on any subject, then you deserve all your money back. That's the reality of it. But we were still involved with that. The first significant case that I was involved with was, it's generally called the Laity Case, after the Mr. Justice Laity. All judges in this country have the first name Justice, apparently. So he was Mr. Justice Laity. It sounds good. Sounds like it should have had his own TV series, Mr. Justice Laity. And he had a case brought before him. And what had happened was that a couple had broken up in Scientology, and the wife really wasn't all that keen on Scientology. And so the way that it had been dealt with was that they'd had a chaplain's interview. Now, a chaplain, for anybody who doesn't know about Scientology, is somebody who has absolutely no training in anything, but wears a costume that makes them look as if they're a pastoral counselor within a Christian church. And it was decided that because the husband had contributed so much more to Scientology, i.e., he'd given them a lot more money, that he was therefore a better parent. That seemed to be the, my understanding of it. He was a good Scientologist. She wasn't so sure. And she ended up leaving 2 infant children with her husband. And a couple of years later, remarried to a husband who, by now they were both ex-Scientologists. And they'd set up the case. They came to me, or it must have been about April 1984, and said, could I help them? And I was amazed to see what they'd put together. They had done an astonishing job. This is where I first met Jerry Armstrong, because they brought him in as a witness, and he had just triumphed in the first Armstrong case in June 1984. And so he was, and they'd got together just an astonishing roster of witnesses. My addition to it was that the father in the case had said that he thought that disconnection was just the most terrible thing. And I was able to provide a letter that he'd written to his business partner explaining how they could still stay in business by putting up a partition through the stairs and having their offices separated so they'd never have to communicate. And I brought the business partner in as a witness as well. But that case was quite remarkable. It was a family case. And as is normal in a family case, it's held in camera. It's held in a closed court with nobody able to get in, certainly no media. And the judge, after hearing about Scientology for a couple of weeks, decided he'd got to make a public ruling. And the ruling was more than 50 pages long. And he basically denounced Scientology. It made, I think, 3 front pages of the newspapers, and it was a big event. What happened after that is, of course, at the appeal court, the judgment was withdrawn from public view because it was improper for him to have made a judgment in that way.
Let me just quote from his judgment so people get the idea of the tenor of what he was saying. I just looked it up here and just get a couple of quotes from this. Scientology is, but this is a direct quote from the justice. Scientology is both immoral and socially obnoxious. In my judgment, it is corrupt, sinister, and dangerous.
Yes.
It is corrupt because it is based on lies and deceit and has as its real objective money and power for Mr. L. Ron Hubbard, his wife, and those close to him at the top. It is sinister because it indulges in infamous practices both to its adherents, who do not toe the line unquestioningly, and to those who criticize or oppose it. It is dangerous because it is out to capture people, especially children and impressionable young people, and indoctrinate and brainwash them so that they become the unquestioning captives and tools of the cult, withdrawn from ordinary thought, living, and relationships with others, end quote. And if that is not the first judge who actually gets it, I mean, wow.
Well, he was the second judge who actually got it.
Yeah.
Because right. Breckinridge had ruled in the Armstrong case in similar tenor. Yep. That there is nothing that strong before, but both Breckinridge and Laity, they poured over a lot of evidence. I've read all of the Armstrong transcripts along the way, a couple of thousand pages of those. And Breckinridge's comments are insightful. He asks questions. He's curious about what's happening. I must say that it saddens me that the majority of judges seem to hide behind legal fences rather than taking this on in a straightforward manner and realizing that this is indeed a dangerous group that is out to capture people, to enslave people psychologically, and will not fulfill any of its promises. It'll just have a lot of starry-eyed people who are saying, yes, well, I'm going to have supernatural powers by next Tuesday if I can find $100,000, So it had a significant impact. I don't think that Scientology has ever been very strong in the UK. Even when Hubbard was here from 1959 to 1965, 66, he was, bringing over a few hundred people. It wasn't a massive. And after that, it just sort of petered out. And I think the Laity decision was a crippling blow in the United Kingdom. I think that the next, I was involved in a group of suits together in LA in 1988. I first visited LA in 1986 and got to meet some very interesting ex-members, because of course that's the heartland, really. My opinion was asked in one of the cases with David Mayo. Now, David Mayo had, for those who don't know, he was put forward as the heir apparent. He was the man who was going to succeed L. Ron Hubbard. We had no doubt of that. And then suddenly he was thrown out, and he became really the focus of the whole independent movement, with his advanced ability centers, as they were called, the first one in Santa Barbara. And he then affiliated with Frank Sarge Gabodi up in Palo Alto. And Sarge had bought an old Mormon church, which was this beautiful building, modern building, but it was a bit strange having this spire on it, and all of this stuff going on. But it made it almost seem that Scientology might be a religion or something, which to me was a totally foreign idea, I must say. It was never a part of my thinking, nor most of the people I knew when I was involved in the 70s and early 80s.
It's funny because I, as an impressionable young lad, on this point, and concurrent at the same time, I mean, we're talking about 85, 86, 87 time period. Actually 84, 85, because I went and partook in the protests of the Portland ruling down in Los Angeles. And this was 84, 85, I guess, before
That's the Christopherson Tichborne case.
Yeah. Actually, yeah, I think it was after I started doing classes. I think so, in high school. Yeah, it was. So I had already started, so it had to have been after 85. But somewhere in there, 85, 86, I went out and protested, and religious freedom now, and like I said, impressionable young lad, 15, 16 years old, driving around, looking at all these people really amped up about this, because it was protest mode. It wasn't just regular, daily business mode. And I don't know, I kind of, until you just said that just now, I'd sort of not really thought about what an impression that had made on me as to the religious aspects of Scientology, because I landed right in the thick of it. With their using the religious cloaking for protesting, the legal case that they had lost up in Portland. So that was my exposure to it at the same time, so we had a very different experience on that point, I think, which was kind of funny.
Yeah, I mean, I never considered Scientology to be a religion. It always seemed to me that I remember having friends who'd dodged the draft by doing the minister's course, which took 1 week, and you read a book by, was it Houston Smith or somebody, about the world's religions, and now you're a minister.
That's right. The great religions of the world.
The great religions of the world.
Little tiny thin little book. I read it. It's a little tiny book.
Yeah. And I don't know if he did anything good, but that book was really not very useful, I must say. You became an ordained minister after you'd done it. And then there were the symbols like the cross and all of this stuff. And it all seemed like a front. It all seemed like, we were a scientifically established psychotherapy. Why did we need to pretend to be a religion? Well, tax purposes. And also making sure that, one of the terrible things for Hubbard that happened very early on was that the New Jersey Medical Association sued the original Hubbard Dianetic Research Foundation for practicing medicine without a license. And then, as Wilhelm Reich was just about to go to prison for doing exactly that, Hubbard had to get this thing that would be a barrier that would stop that from happening. And, the religion angle, as he called it in his letter to Alan O'Brien of the 10th of April 1953, what do you think of the religion angle? We could hardly be doing worse than we are doing.
And also, Hubbard made direct reference to Reich in his lectures. He definitely knew, and said that he had been railroaded, he'd been destroyed, he'd been run out of existence. Now, if you go look up who this guy is, he was a pseudoscience peddler. I mean, he was just a nutcase. And Hubbard just thought...
He's an astonishing character, Wilhelm Reich. He's one of the last of the great pupils of Freud. And so he had a proper background. And he decided that where Freud was wrong was, it was about sex, but it was about people who couldn't have a proper orgasm. And so his first big idea was that Hitler was somebody who didn't enjoy sex enough, and that's why he had to go and murder people. And that's the psychology of fascism for you. But then he moved to the US and he got into this thing about pyramids and aluminum foil, as it's called in the US. Aluminium is the actually wrong English word. But yes, okay, I admit it, occasionally the British are wrong. But this thing of, like sitting with little folded bit of Alcan foil on your head, and I don't know why you think that's mad.
I have my doubts as to its scientific validity. Let me put it that way.
And orgone therapy, that you're kind of getting these cosmic rays and you've got to stop it or something. But
that's right.
Yeah, he did.
Yeah, he really went off the deep end,
and prison probably wasn't the right place for him. There are other places that can be more helpful to lunatics than prison. But
yes,
never mind. Hubbard was aware of this, and religion was a protection. When the Great Transformation happened at the end of Hubbard's life, I see him around about 1982, 83. He's terrified that he's going to lose Scientology because the Guardian's office are going to get together with the mission holders. So he has to break that up. And that's where the Commodore's messengers, the Watchdog Committee in October 82, take over. Or so it seemed from the outside. The reality was that Hubbard was absolutely in control and gradually becoming more demented. And you get this switch where, my generation of Scientologists, let's face it, we're hippies. The 1950s generation were science fiction fans, And
engineers.
And engineers, exactly. Yeah. Astounding Science Fiction was read by physicists and engineers, who loved the stories and sadly got involved with Ron Hubbard. Some of them. I mean, for me, it's a terrible tragedy that A. Van Vogt, who I regard as one of the great science fiction writers, never wrote another word of fiction after Dianetics. I was in touch with him in 1984. So for 34 years, he had practiced a form of Dianetics. He never believed in reincarnation or any of that, but he really still believed. And this wonderful mind, the guy who wrote The World of Null A, was taken off to do something which, well, I don't know, he had a life, but he could have blossomed further as Heinlein and other of Hubbard's associates did. Never mind. I'll get over it. But
it's collateral damage, really. It's how this has gone.
There was a difference that what we now got was kind of aggressive street thugs who believed that they were part of a religion. The Scientology suddenly transformed from being, relatively dippy hippies, who are all, we're doing this for the peace and love of the universe, into this almost military cult that has echoes of the brown shirts for me. The fervor, the intensity of loathing, which was something I'd never seen in Scientology. Hatred was not an essential aspect of Scientology when I was involved. By 1984, hatred was the bottom line, as Miscavige put it back in 82. They were tough and they were ruthless. And that word bothered me. We are without mercy. And for me, a religion that's without mercy is not probably a very good religion. But
that's very true. I'll comment here because I think it's important to the narrative that these are people who were raised under L. Ron Hubbard's tutelage, literally 24/7 on the boat with Hubbard, or once they went to shore, were standing watches outside his office, inside his bedroom. I mean, they were there all the time.
Showering him, 13-year-old girls.
That's right, and boys too, because there were Mark Yeager and David Rousseau, a few others, David Miscavige eventually. He only stood a few watches, but he was around, and he was in
Gillam was one of the Gillam children, were the first three, and Peter is,
That's right. So there were boys and girls, more girls than boys, because I think that's just kind of how it worked out as to who was having what babies, But it was interesting that if you look at what they were being raised with, not just in the vicinity of Hubbard, but the actual written orders, policies, the OSA, the GO, the old GO directives that would be written for the Guardian's office, which, which don't do anything but inculcate a paranoid worldview that everybody in the world is out to get L. Ron Hubbard and Scientology, and these are major players.
They receive no other education.
Exactly.
These are
That's right.
Uneducated people, unfortunately.
That's right. Yeah. Or we could say very minimal education. There was some lip service given on the ship to it, but they themselves were resistive. They only wanted to get the Scientology stuff.
Well, they weren't spending 5 hours a day studying English, German, mathematics, physics. They didn't take examinations.
Nope.
Their right to education was taken away from them. And as you say, their fervor and the idea that they would run about the ship giving Hubbard's orders, and they were meant to give them in his tone of voice. And I remember, I think I mentioned this before, that a 14-year-old who came out in December 83, and he told me he was the second in command of the whole of the UK. And then he said, but there are kids doing things as well. And I'm going, you're 14. And it meant that they were being pulled away from normal life and given power. And the situation did arise where they would be giving briefings about out 2D, about people, committing adultery, as some people would put it, that you'd have some 12-year-old telling you off for having sex outside of your marriage or what have you. And a puritanical fervor built up again that during the late 1960s, from my research as I became involved in 74, Scientology in some places was pretty damn promiscuous. So the Manchester organization, for example, the Los Angeles organization in 68, Captain Bill Robertson told me that, there were 2 lesbians running it and they were into bondage and stuff like that. Good for them.
Well, I heard the Sea Org in its formative years was pretty racy itself. They were on boats, they were in tight quarters under high stress conditions. What do you think is going to happen?
Yeah. And then you get the reversal that for something to be an authoritarian cult, it will control your sexuality. It will tell you what you have to do, and that will either be not have sex or have sex with everyone. The Rajneeshi approach towards it. He boasted that they were going to be the first AIDS-free community because they wore rubber gloves and condoms. I'd like to point out there were many AIDS-free communities before AIDS came along, so Rajneesh was wrong about that. How many people ended up in psychiatric hospitals because of the being pushed into a room with 50 other people, and it's just appalling. But so anyway, my second trip to Los Angeles, and we've pushed forward a bit. We managed about 6 weeks the last time we spoke.
Yeah, right. That's right. Just to wrap on the brown shirts comment, I wanted to reinforce for the audience and maybe anybody who's coming in newly to this, it's not a false equivalency. It's not a weird comparison. It's actually right on, because these were people who had been raised in this environment. They were exclusively loyal to L. Ron Hubbard personally, and that was, they might as well have taken loyalty oaths, but they didn't even need to, because they had just been there.
Billion-year contracts.
Yeah, exactly, right?
They would follow command,
That's right, follow command intention, the very first point of the Sea Org, the code of the Sea Org member, and they were all Sea Org members. Right? I promised.
We will be other determined for 1 billion years.
Yeah, I promised to uphold, forward, and carry out command intention.
And what did command do? Command just went, I'm gone in 1986.
Exactly. So actually, even earlier when he took off in his Bluebird. But point is, their place, their headspace was a fanatical devotion headspace. That's where they were at. And they then executed L. Ron Hubbard's orders with ruthless efficiency, because to them, ruthless efficiency was a feature, not a bug, right? Yeah, and that's where they were at, and that's what they did, and that's how they almost destroyed. They did destroy a whole bunch of people's lives.
They most certainly did. They most certainly did. And you have all of the dynamics of Robert J. Lifton's 8 deadly sins of thought reform this demand for purity and the notion that purity is fulfilling whatever the guru demands, and you have to do these things. I came to know several former members of the Watchdog Committee, which was at one time there were 14 of them, and they were, theoretically, they took their orders from Hubbard and they ran Scientology. The executive director international, the president of the Church of Scientology, they took their orders from the Watchdog Committee. And it was interesting to me that I can certainly think of three of them. I'm happy to name Didi Vogading because she never asked me to keep her name private. But I was charmed by these people. They were good people. They weren't, let's take away the invidious part of the comparison, which is they weren't Nazis. They weren't people who wished to destroy anybody. But in the same way that the Nazis were brought to believe that Jews and Romanis and blacks were vermin to be destroyed, you saw this tendency to say, well, anybody who opposes Scientology, of course, that's a different matter. You can do whatever you want to them because they're opposing the freedom of the world. I remember a guy he came to see me and he boasted that he had taken an afternoon off course in 1971 to go and get the first printing of the government's report on Scientology, the Foster report, which is a beautiful, remarkably well-researched piece of work, and more than half of it is the words of L. Ron Hubbard himself. But this guy boasted to me that he'd gone and done this, and he'd come to see me because he absolutely believed in Scientology. He was a disabled man. He had a problem with one of his legs. He was living on disability and he couldn't afford Scientology. But he still believed that people like me should be destroyed because the only hope for humanity was the technology of Scientology. And you're just looking at this poor man who had, this was, 15 years, 12 years after he'd gone to get this printing that he could boast about. And he was still caught up in this horrible trap, this horrible set of beliefs. So, I'm at no point suggesting that this organization is like the brown shirts or indeed the black shirts afterwards in the sense of its violence, though there is, more violence than there should be within the SEAL. There shouldn't be any. But there is this fervor. There's this demand for purity. There's the notion of a sacred science that, that everything we're told is true and we've got to do it. And these are the last days. And if we don't, Armageddon, it's like, talking with a Jehovah's Witness. The apocalypse is now. And if, I want Scientologists to survive World War III, as L. Ron Hubbard said in 1978. This, winding people up to get them to behave in a certain way, it became more and more desperate through the 1980s. I guess because more than half of the membership had left. And there were, one or two of us who were standing up and saying, what you're doing is wrong. And here's what Ron Hubbard says about it. And here's where he contradicts it, and we were not much liked for that. Anyway, 1988.
No, yeah. So
I was asked to consult to a case in Los Angeles called Freedom for All in Religion, FAIR. And there were 412 plaintiffs who were taking a class action against various Scientology entities. I was asked over and my expenses were paid. Sadly, I wasn't paid a fee. I'd just like to underline that again. Send me the check now. I went over to LA and there was a problem. They were a class of people who were suing a class of organizations and individuals. They'd already lost David Miscavige from the suit and I believe had to pay $5,000 for not being able to prove why they were suing him, why they were a class, and why the other group were a class. And I took with me the material that showed that all of the Scientology entities, Authors Service Incorporated, the Church of Spiritual Technology, the Religious Technology Center, the Church of Scientology of California, and on and on. I took over the corporate filings for those groups many of which actually came from an earlier case, a guy called Larry Dahlquist, or Larry West, who had long since disappeared into the mists of history, but he did a very good job on getting hold of corporate filings. By getting hold of those and by getting some statements from former members who had signed undated resignations from these corporations and putting together the argument that Scientology, far from being hundreds of distinct corporations that simply shared the same spiritual technology, that they were completely a monolithic organization. And I did what is called piercing the corporate veil. It's the legal term for it. It sounds obscene now I come to think about it. But what I did was to say, yeah, they are a class. Now, I think FAIR by that time had filed 4 times, and each time the judge had said, no, you're going to have to go and amend this claim. Now, normally the second one would have been, that's it, you're out. But the judge was obviously quite tolerant towards their aims. My argument as to why all of the Scientology entities were a class was accepted and was later, in fact, used by the IRS. It was also used by Ben Corridan. And it found its way into the Wollersheim case as well, because Wollersheim's case, of course, was against the Church of Scientology of California, which by the time he won the $9.2 million that they did have to, they paid it in thin dimes, I think. But the money they did have to pay, there was not one thin dime for Wollersheim. Well, $9.2 million, so much for that promise. But his case was against an organization which by the time he looked like he'd won, really didn't have very much money left. So he would have got, I think it was $120,000, and that was the end of that. He could have used the name Church of Scientology of California on his business cards, of course, but might not have been quite the right image for Lawrence, I don't think.
No, and that was Scientology pulling a fast one on him too, because they were sucking money out of that organization that he was suing, because it had been the mother church when he started the suit. And the function changed midstream specifically to protect the church against Wollersheim's efforts.
And I was able to find some testimony to that effect as well. That what was called the corporate sort out that Larry Brennan, who later became Denise Brennan, that he put together, making sure that all of these things could go on. Excuse me, I have some noise in the background here. And it's gone away.
Okay.
That there was a very concerted effect in effort in 81, 82 to completely change the corporate structure. And exactly at that point, the Church of Scientology of California, which had always been a front, it wasn't the first church. Hubbard had, filed 3 months before in December 53 in Camden, New Jersey. But it was the group that was put forward to us as the mother church, and all of the money had been leached out of it. And I had some testimony about how that had happened. So that was all accepted. But the other problem was, how did we take these 412 people and make them into a class? What was the thing that all of them had in common? And here, I was a week in LA sitting with the lawyers, talking with a couple of brilliant researchers I knew in LA. And we were trying to figure out what you could do, because even though Scientology was not accepted as having religious status, it nonetheless could hide behind the shield of spiritual claims. And, so you can't sue the Catholic Church for saying there's a heaven. You can't go prove it in court. You promised me there was a heaven. Where is it? Show it to me. You can't do it. So I had to push aside all of the things that could be called spiritual claims. And I came up with just one simple idea. And that was that Scientology still continued to sell the book Dianetics, The Modern Science of Mental Health. And Dianetics was still a sub-section of Scientology. So the claims that were made for cure, asthma, arthritis, allergies, that's just the A's. Cancer, leukemia, raising from the dead, the various claims that Hubbard had made of cure still stood. And the particular claim that was being made was that if you did Scientology within a period of can't remember what the top limit is. I think 1,500 hours or something. But within a certain period, you would achieve the state of clear, and that meant you would be brilliant, have total recall of everything that ever happened to you, be immune to diseases, you would never catch a cold again, have no psychosomatic ailments. You'd be Superman, basically. And that claim, the lawyers almost kissed me. And one of them took me aside. He said, for 2 years, we've been trying to understand what these people were talking about. And you finally... Now, 6 months later, not having heard from the steering committee of affair, I put in a phone call, which in those days was an expensive thing to do to Los Angeles, no free Skype. And said, well, what happened to the case? And he said, oh, it's been dismissed. And I said, oh, how did they rule on the class? And it was, oh, yeah, the Scientologists as a class, yes, that was accepted. But I said, well, what about my argument that the offer of the state of clear binds all of you together and that none of you received it and it was a false promise? And there was a pause. And I was told we didn't want to denigrate the state of clear, so we didn't put it forward. Most of the people involved in this suit were still making their living from auditing people from Scientology. And yeah, that was the obstacle I couldn't overcome for them. If I think I managed to get a couple of the members of the steering committee to wonder about it, and they later became major players against Scientology. But it was, there was still so much of that left. And because, of course, for me, it was long gone. It was 5 years ago, 4 years ago, I'd stopped believing any of that. So I didn't mind denigrating the state of clear, because the state of clear is an absolute perfidious nonsense. There's never been a clear. And the 273 cases that L. Ron Hubbard said he'd done before publishing Dianetics, not one of them's ever come forward. Let alone Sonia Bianca, the first clear, or John McMaster, the 273 people he cleared, not one of them's ever appeared. So
I have a question though, real fast, because there were, how many people were in this class action?
As I remember, 412.
That's what I thought you said. And all of them, or a majority of them,
the steering committee of 6 people decided what would happen.
Okay, the steering committee, got it. So when you have something like this, you put a set number of people sort of as the guys who are going to sort of oversee the thing, so we don't have to take a vote every time there's a decision to be made. But that decision was major and majorly stupid.
It could have had an incredible impact if it had just going to court, whether they'd won or not. It could have had an incredible impact.
That's right. And it would have established the class too. Because this is the thing I hear about all the time from people. Why don't you guys do a class action? Why not do a class action? It's kind of like, because it's incredibly difficult to organize and set up and pay for, and all the things you have to go through to do it. It's not easy, and then to find out it was organized and rolling, and then they just screwed it up so badly.
And it's absolutely understandable, but to anybody who says, why don't you do a class action, having been involved in something like 150 cases involving Scientology over the years, about 10 of them involving me directly, I became very familiar with the law. I became very familiar with the process of the law. And, the great lion in this story is Lawrence Wollersheim. Wollersheim is the only person who held on tight and went all the way. And it took 20 years, and it took up every shred of his time throughout that time. The man is an incredibly courageous and brave man. But almost, when Christopherson Tichborne, when that case, she had a ruling for $35 million. And it just started as a repayment case where they wouldn't give her her money back, I think. And it became this, and the judge ruled for her. And then they managed to convince the judge, if I remember properly, that he had allowed a closing speech by the prosecution or by the plaintiff's counsel saying that Scientology was not truly a religion, and he therefore had to dismiss the whole ruling. And at that point, of course, after she'd spent so many years. I think it was the third trial they'd been through.
And it had started in the 70s. I mean, it had gone on for at least 10 years.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was an incredible ordeal for her.
Yeah, and the cases that Michael Flynn ran, I think there were 26 cases in all. Starting with Lavender Van Schaik, who, of course, she went to him and said, "I've been to all of these lawyers. I think it was $3,000 back from Scientology. If you take the case on, you'll get a letter saying I've had, terminations or, whatever. You'll get a letter with all of this personal information." And Flynn said, "How could they possibly know that about you?" And she said, "Well, I told them." And he kind of went, "But the CIA, it would have taken them 2 years to find all of that stuff out." And he said, "I'm not taking a case." And off she went. And 3 days later, he got the letter talking about a home goal. That they actually, so he looked at it and he went, "Okay," and rang her up. And that's how all of that started. And it ended with a $5 million payoff and these famous silence contracts that people then broke. I mean, I think Bill Franks' contract was the first to go public to say what he was meant not to say, and that, all of this stuff. But the answer is that litigation is always painful. Having been on the receiving end of quite a lot of it and spent about 10 years of my life in court, you will be ripped apart as an individual. Everything that you have ever done will be made public. Everything that you didn't actually do will be made public. All of the gossip and the rumors and all of this stuff. I found myself in a situation in one case where a guy had made a witness statement saying that he'd seen a psychiatric report saying that I was psychotic. Now, what he'd seen was a letter from a psychiatrist saying it'd be all right for me to get a prescription for a muscle relaxant, which you had to say. But I'd shown him this letter and there was nothing in there that said I was psychotic. However, if I challenged this in court, I'd have to put the letter into court. And it meant that I'd be putting my medical records into court. And the thing that I didn't want anybody to know then, and it's still illegal here now, was that I used cannabis, which, where you live, is perfectly okay now in Colorado.
Yes, it is. Much of America at this point.
Yeah. I think you have 11 states where it's legal. And, of course, Canada, which has a prime minister who has been known to wear blackface, has complete legalization, following on from Uruguay, the first country to legalize. But at that time, nowadays in this country, people just say, "So what?" But, 30 years ago, this was, and so I didn't want to produce a letter where I'd had a psychiatrist say, there is no problem with him using cannabis, which is what it said, to prove that he didn't say I was psychotic. So you get into these twists and tangles. I mentioned the Mayo case, which was the David Mayo case, which I also consulted to in my visit in June 1988 to Los Angeles. And I'd actually been depositioned as a witness in this case by the famous Joseph Yanni, who was a fairly vehement lawyer who was a Scientologist. And I'd had I'd never been in one of these things before. We don't do depositions in this country. And the idea...
you were in for a treat.
Yeah.
Oh, man. I can't think of anything worse than a deposition for your average Joe citizen to go through.
It's terrible because in court you can have an instant ruling, and we basically, the barrister here who was, chairing the deposition, did not understand the deposition rules. I hadn't read them. I had no idea. The next time I was in a deposition, which was with Kendrick Moxon, and that was great fun. I read the deposition rules, so I knew, when I said, I don't wish to answer that question, it's not relevant. The woman in the first thing said, you don't have any choice. It is, the judge will later on decide whether this can be included as evidence. And I'm saying, but if I answer these questions, Scientology will just make this public. You're saying they can ask me anything they want about my private life, and I have to answer. That process would not be possible in an English court of law. We don't have the deposition process. And, this idea of honor among lawyers, oh, come on, thieves are a lot more honorable than lawyers. It's like they're using lawyers in experiments these days because there's some things that rats just won't do, Sorry, that's a Robin Williams joke, in case you didn't laugh at it. It's, I found myself in a situation where a private letter that I'd written to somebody was suddenly being held up, and I had to explain what I'd meant by the jokes that I'd made about Captain Bill in it. And, when you realize that your diaries can go into court, that your hard drive can go into court, that the only confidential relationship you have in the world, it's not with your doctor, it's not with your priest, it's not with your counselor. The only actual one that's recognized is with your own lawyer. The only person that you can say whatever you like to and it not go into court. That was a shock. But I did have a situation in that deposition which was beautiful. I started answering a question and the lawyers on both sides leapt up at the same moment and told me to stop. Because neither of them, it was damaging to both of their cases for me to tell the truth. And this was the truth about the theft of, or borrowing of the upper level materials from Copenhagen, which I was not directly involved in, but I knew all of the people involved in it very well. And the day that they got back with the packs, I was in the room and helped them drink the champagne while they photocopied them. So, I did have some direct involvement. A few years later, Joe Yanni, their lawyer in the deposition, having been thrown out or left, came up to me and we had a conversation. And he still didn't believe that I'd told the truth, that there hadn't been some kind of deal going on of, where they were swapping OT5 materials with David Mayo to get something. And as far as I knew, there wasn't. And I'd spoken with, John Nelson and David Mayo and Harvey Haber and various people on their side. And that, so Yanni was convinced that I was a very clever liar. And, I'm going to make this boast. I've spent tens of hours on the witness stand or in depositions. I have never once distorted the truth in any way under oath. And, but obviously, there's still plenty of time.
Well, it's interesting that a former Scientologist and Scientology lawyer was absolutely convinced that you had. And the reason I say that is so interesting is because it's the clearest case of projection I can think of. I mean, here's a guy who's used to people clearly because he's absolutely positive, even after he comes out of Scientology, isn't their lawyer anymore. He's still got this idea, which means it was a basic, it was based on a deeply held belief. And clearly this man did not, his moral compass when it came to the legal system couldn't accommodate the idea that somebody would just tell the truth. I mean, there's a lot you can conjecture from that, maybe too much, but I'm just trying to point out that's, Scientology doesn't help that mindset at all. It reinforces it.
Yeah. And the idea that there might be, some honorable people in the world.
Right. Yeah. He couldn't believe it. Even after he left Scientology, which of course I stress it a couple times only because it's sad, but true that that people leave these groups and hold on to so much of the belief, so much of the views, and it really takes this is why I keep harping on this thing, that it takes a dedicated effort on the part of cult survivors to shed those thought processes. It takes work to do it. If you don't put that work in, you're still walking around as half a cultist.
This is to me the most essential message. I mean, I was steamrollered. I had 12 years of harassment. We've talked about that on an earlier show. And it was horrifying. There was no support from the community of ex-members. There was no support ultimately from the legal system. a harassment act was actually passed at the exact time that which would have protected me from much of what was done. But so I just had to go. And that was in January 96. I wrote my last piece. There's no silence contract. I was not paid off. None of that happened. I decided, because the legal system wouldn't support me, even though I was telling the truth and I hadn't done the things, that they were trying to, accuse me of. So 17 years then went by, and I had 4 more years of harassment because they weren't going to quit. But 17 years went by, and I realized that and I was not involved in any counter Scientology activity. I was involved with very few ex-members during that time. I became interested in researching terrorism as another fanatical system. I read up about tens and tens of religious and psychotherapy groups. I just gathered information. I wrote novels, I painted pictures, I did other things. But then in late 2012, I think it was, I was introduced to an ex-member in Australia who had the most dreadful time from, her parents got in when she was 2. She was abused throughout childhood. It was covered up by the Citizens Commission on Human Rights, by a woman called Janice Eastgate, who I'm going to name here. Sue me, go on.
Well, she got busted already. I think good. For this. I mean, yeah, she got busted hard internally and externally, but within and outside of Scientology. She's not her name is kind of mud at this point.
Yeah, I mean, she was to stand trial for what she'd done, and then it was found that Australian law, when she'd committed the offence, then this girl was 11 years old when she had her, take back her statement to the police. But when that offence was committed, the law that she was being sued for didn't exist, so she walked. But I was told
it was only by the hair of her chinny chin chin that she got out of that.
Yeah, absolutely.
She really lucked out, and she got in major international trouble. Scientology's names was on international headlines over that whole fiasco.
Yes, absolutely, it was, as it should have been. And an Australian television reporter called Steve Kinane, who and who wrote a fantastic book called Fair Game about the history of Scientology in Australia, which is in places incredibly funny. And very insightful. It basically shows you what the reason that there were inquiries in Australia, the Victoria one being the first one, was because a guy had asked for his money back. He'd asked for a few $1,000s back. When Hubbard didn't give it to him and wouldn't give it to him, and they communicated directly, he used all of his connections, and he was an utterly corrupt human being who had connections in the Labour Party in Australia, and he used them and brought down the wrath of the state of Victoria upon, and 2 other of the 6 Australian states upon L. Ron Hubbard, because the guy wouldn't give a few dollars back because he was mean and selfish, and he met his match. But it's a great book. But
it is actually. Shameless plug. I've had Steve on this show. I'll put a link in the description here. We talked about all of this stuff. It was a wonderful podcast.
Yeah, and one of my favorite interview with, of course, my favorite interviews are with you, Chris. But my favorite interview with somebody who's not, shared the experience that we've shared, a wog, if you want, a raw meat, dead in the head wog, to use L. Ron Hubbard's scriptural terms for such people, was with Steve Kinane. He was in Copenhagen. He sat down. He put a recorder on the table. We talked for an hour. And it was so great to actually have somebody who really understood the subject. He was an outsider, but he knew all the questions. And that's, I think ABC Australia still have that up somewhere. But that was good fun. But Steve, he's a journalist, right? He's a reporter. He's a TV presenter, this kind of thing. And frankly, my opinion of such people is not tremendously high. I want a victim in a picture. I've said this before. I said this the last time we spoke. And every now and then you meet one of these people, like Paul Brackey, who was at the Brighton Evening Post, or Ian Williamson, who was with The Independent, or of course Tony Ortega or Paulette Cooper, people who they won't stop. They want justice to be done. And Steve's one of those kind of people. And he'd come over from Australia to interview me, and I would only at that time, I'd talk with people where there was abuse of children involved, always. And I would, free of charge, and I would talk with people who were writing books, unless they were Janet Reitman, because she was just rude, and I'm offering free help, and you would argue with me. No, forget it. Steve came to me, said he's writing a book, so I said, okay, I'll see you. And he actually did pay me as well, which is quite unusual. I think it was $400 or something, but nonetheless, it was something. And he said, look, there's this woman in Australia, and she's really been messed up by this, and would you talk with her? And I kind of went, I don't really do that kind of thing anymore. And I found out about how to use Google Hangouts or whatever it's called, and or Skype, and talked with this woman. And she had, abused till 11, put back in the household by Jan Eastgate, 5 more years in the household, being physically attacked by this guy. He, by the way, pled guilty to abusing her, so there is no doubt of this.
And Jan Eastgate, I realize we haven't said this, so we should say this now, just to put the context. Jan Eastgate was the head of the Citizens Commission on Human Rights, first in Australia, then internationally. And when this came out, and she got busted over this, she was then in the international head of CCHR. So that's who she is, and that's her fight was always anti-psychiatry, anti-psychiatric abuse. But apparently, she was okay with domestic abuse if releasing that information was somehow going to harm the Church of Scientology or one of its adherents.
This girl was sexually molested for 5 years from the age of 6, and she was, as far as human rights, Hubbard tended to redefine words, propaganda by redefinition of words. He said it. Human rights obviously meant something very different to Scientology than it does to me. But I talked with her, and we're still great friends actually, and we still talk every couple of weeks. At 16, she'd escaped into the Sea Organization. She had 5 years of that, and she then escaped at 21. I thought I was going to be talking to a woman. She went and got a degree, a medical degree. I thought I'd be talking to a woman who was, I don't know, in her 20s or something. She was, in fact, 37 by this time. So she'd had 16 years afterwards. And she said to me, John, is reality actually agreement? Now, this is a woman with a degree in the medical subject, scientific degree. Is reality really agreement? And I said, if you're the hypnotist, yes. But for the rest of us, no. And the next week when we spoke, she said that she had used a scented laundry conditioner in her washing. And we both knew that we hadn't talked about the Sea Org hygiene hat. And this meant that she had, my thing about helping people to recover is very simple. It's not thousands of hours of counseling. I've never seen anybody more than 6 times in a counseling situation, never. Because if I can't do it in that time, you're going to become dependent on me. And that's not a good idea. So I'm sorry for any Freudian analysts out there who do 3 sessions a week for 5 years. I don't believe in what you're doing. The point is to trigger a spot where the person is willing to question, where they're willing to say, is that true? And once you've done that, so what had happened to her during the week was that she'd gone, for the first time in her life, she'd been willing to use something scented, because of course under the Hubbard rules, no scents, no soap, shampoo, spray, perfume, nothing, because it's all the psychs using roses to rule the universe. And so
if that sounds crazy, by the way, folks, it's not. That's actually what Hubbard wrote in the issue about fragrances or scents. That's what we're talking about. And he hated anything with perfumes or fragrances and banned anything like that on all Sea Org bases. So, and it's not necessarily like it's a destructive practice, but like everything in Scientology, he takes it to 11. And, you can't have any scent of any kind, to the point that I used to have Sea Org executives walk into a room, their nose would crinkle up. They'd be like, who's using scented products in here? And that's kind of how their voice would sound when they said it. And they'd look around and everybody would suddenly get this hunted look and like, and you had to find out who in the room was using Irish Spring. So that's how crazy this would get. Okay. So if you think that you can't take anything and make it crazy, Hubbard could even take a sensible thing like, let's not use overly fragranced or scented things, to an extreme that is ridiculous. And that's why this was so significant for this woman. I just wanted to plug that in there, because he directly connected it to psychs and mind control and said that was the whole point.
Yeah, that rose perfume is being used to control us all. So this is right. A man who didn't like the smell of roses.
That's right. I mean, it sounds like such a joke. You just, the audience would just kind of go along. Oh, that's funny. No, guys, it was real. We really lived like that,
Rajneeshis, if they were to go into the presence of Rajneesh, had to be sniffed.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, they had sniffers because he again, and it's made me sort of wonder, maybe the temporal lobe epilepsy that Hubbard almost undoubtedly suffered from, that heightened sense perception is an aspect of it. And
yeah, could have been.
Others would fit into it. I mean, also, they were both raised by a grandparent. But I mean, Jesse Prince, at Toronto when we did the Getting Clear conference in 2015, and please go out and buy it, because it cost you about $3 a session, and Jim Beverly needs to make some of the money back that he spent on that. But Jesse was, it was like watching a comedy show. He was so good on the stage. But the story that I most remember is where Miscavige tried to get rid of him by assigning him to be the guy that would send the weekly reports to Hubbard. And there were bankers' boxes full of all the reports from all the organizations. L. Ron Hubbard's not running Scientology. Oh, yeah, really? And the person before had been busted because he could smell rose perfume in the boxes. And Jesse was left with this situation. He was a heavy smoker at the time, so he had no sense of smell. And he really didn't know what to do. And he hit upon an answer, and the answer was to just send the boxes to Hubbard. Don't sign the thing, don't do anything. And he got a commendation from Hubbard saying that he'd understood that the perfume was in the ink, in the pen with which he would have signed the form. And Miscavige was very annoyed because he thought he'd finally get rid of Jesse Prince. So lots and lots of wonderful stories. Should we get back to David
Yes,
Mayo?
Please continue. The segues are awesome and people learn from them. But yeah, let's get back to the main line.
Well, the realization is this, that the most, if you do not stop believing something, you keep believing it. If you think that affinity, reality, and communication equal understanding, then that's where you'll live. And they don't. By increasing communication, you do not inevitably increase affinity, as L. Ron Hubbard says, because as L. Ron Hubbard says, bullets too are a form of communication. Screaming at somebody is a form of communication. It doesn't raise affinity. And at that point, the whole basis of this magical triangle, and it was meant to be magical, folks, falls apart. It's a nonsense. It's not a piece of science anymore. It's just some old twit thinking something foolish that he wants to impose on the rest of us. So it's to think you have to be able to question the doctrine, the dogma, the beliefs you have, and and the unquestionable assumptions that you have made. As a little boy, I was taught that I had to love everybody because Jesus loved everybody. And it was only in my time as an intervention counselor with Scientologists and having a really dreadful experience doing that, being harassed, having 7 carloads of Scientologists and 4 nights without sleep, that I finally got to the position where I think most Sea Organization members live, that I found out what it was like to no longer be able to cope because you're so sleep deprived and so anxious. And so you just become a token that's pushed along by other people. So I had that experience. I went home and this thing popped up in my head and I went, you've got to love everybody. And I was like, well, why? I was like, oh, you can't think that. You mustn't think that. And at that point, I realized that we all live with unquestionable assumptions, particularly QAnon. They live with quite a lot of them.
Yes, they do. Yes, they do.
Anyway, you remember Alice? This is a song about Alice. Mm-hmm. You can get anything you want at Alice's restaurant. Sorry, that's an Ola Guthrie reference we threw in there for anybody who knows Alice's restaurant, because the song isn't indeed about the restaurant at all. And this hasn't been much about David Mayo. They had a problem. They had racked up $2.9 million in costs, Mayo's lawyers, by this point.
Defending him from Scientology because he was practicing using Scientology trademarks outside of the church.
He was practicing Scientology without a license, yes.
Yes, exactly. The Advanced Ability Center, which he'd set up, by the way, right outside Santa Barbara, California, which is where I first got on services. And we heard about David Mayo's group. Yeah.
It was because Harvey Haber lived there and wanted it to be there, I think, that it ended up being there. But, that's a whole other subject, my involvement with David over the years. Interesting man. Very, very clever man, which I didn't realize until 2013, when we talked about Scientology and all of that. He just seemed like he was a usual sort of smart bloke. When I only had one long conversation with him, 3 hours, when he heard I was back in 2013. And it was basically, he actually was, he studied physics as a teenager. He was meant to have gone on to become something remarkable. And instead, he became L. Ron Hubbard's auditor. And I think he did come to regret that at some point. $2.9 million. So, take on a class action again. Why don't you sue them? Well, because they can ruin your life. That's why. And the lawyers, I was introduced to them because Frank Gabodi was funding the case. He'd inherited millions and was very generously at that time until he threw David Mayo overboard in 1993, which is will be the last of my litigation stories probably. He was looking after this, but $2.9 million, and they needed a way to get it back. Now, in this country, costs are tied to the action. In the United States, you need to counter-sue the person to get your cost back, often as not. And they'd got something going on, but they really weren't quite sure what to do. And I had a little thought. And the thought was, why don't you ask them for documents that they then will refuse to give you, that you will then produce, showing that they do have them? And the way to do this, the Church of Spiritual Technology, which took $500 million from the Hubbard estate. There was $648 million in the will. $500 million went to the Church of Spiritual Technology, which basically exists to make sure that the name L. Ron Hubbard will always be remembered. Because he was a narcissist.
Man, and that is true immortality.
Yeah. How stupid can you get?
That's right. And that was the first goal, by the way. That was 1938, letter to his wife, saying that's what he wanted. I mean, that precedes all this nonsense.
And I'm going to boast again. I'm the man that released that letter.
That's right. We owe a debt of gratitude just for that alone.
Yeah, I'm not the man that got it out of Scientology, though. And the guy who got it out of Scientology still won't take credit for it because he'd rather not be harassed. So, I get all of the fame and all of the harassment. But that was a skipper letter. My only goal is to smash my name into history so hard that even if all the books are forgotten, I'll be remembered. I can make Napoleon look like a punk. I'm not sure in what respect he could do that, but I want the names of Hitler and Napoleon and Genghis Khan to be remembered as examples forever. If you want to scare a Turkish child, you just mention Alexander the Great, and he'll come and get you. So I want people to be able to say, Ron Hubbard will get you, and they'll go to sleep and be dutifully good. So they had a problem. And so what I said was, look, Church Spiritual Technology is trying to get tax exemption from the IRS. Let's have somebody pop into the court there in Washington, D.C., copy some material, and then we'll ask for that material. And it worked like clockwork. The Scientology entity, CSI, or whichever, RTC, whichever one was suing Mayo, said, we don't have that material. And so I believe I got them their $2.9 million. I charged them $1,000 for the idea.
John, you are a silly man.
Yeah, there are no two ways about it, are there?
Not really. I mean,
it's when, a few shows ago, you called me a semi-intellectual and I said that means half-wit. You were
exactly.
But I got onto the side of the Corridon case. Bent had he said he had $900,000 in the bank that was taken from him, that his building was worth $2 million, that Riverside, California was worth $2 million. And
now to be clear, so we're super clear, because people might have heard these names bandied about. We're trying to define them as we go. Bent Corridon was a mission holder, right? A very, very successful one. Odd name, but his name was Bent.
It's a Danish name, Bent.
Yeah.
And
okay.
he was from New Zealand. Just to really clarify things. And,
that's good to know, actually. I'd never met him or interacted with him, so I always sort of had this idea it was American because it was Riverside Mission, and it never even occurred to me.
I think he spent most of his life in the US. So, and certainly his accent, I saw him last in 2013. Was still trying to get payment for this job, actually. But, what do you do with people? I only charged him $2,000 and he didn't pay me. He did get his building back.
Wow.
Ultimately, because Jerry Armstrong nagged him, he paid me $1,000. But when I last saw him, you couldn't have. He sounds American. He certainly doesn't sound like a New Zealander.
Right, and he's also the one who worked with Nibs on Madman or Messiah.
Yeah, L. Ron Hubbard, Madman or Messiah. What happened was that he and L. Ron Hubbard Jr., Nibs, signed a contract, and I think it ran 6 weeks before Nibs was threatened and paid and walked away. So what Bent had was a contract that said that he could put L. Ron Hubbard Jr.'s name on the book, which, and he did a good interview with Nibs. So that's fair enough. But Nibs was not the co-author of that book. Brian Ambry was the co-author of that book.
Okay.
And Bent gives him credit for that in the second edition onwards.
Cool.
Book itself, I think, is a bit of a tangle because it's just episodes, chapters about something or other with no continuing narrative. But some of the material is very, very good. He got an interview with the no second wife that L. Ron Hubbard didn't have, Sarah, and he's the only person who did. On her deathbed, she spent, I think, 3 days being recorded telling the L. Ron Hubbard story. But that is material that we will not see until the person who owns it passes away. It will go in through her estate. But yes, L. Ron Hubbard was engaged in magical ceremonies. What a surprise.
Right.
So what we already knew is true, but there will, at some point in the future, be a lot more detail about the nasty things he was doing. Then, there are all sorts of things going on about trademarks and service marks. I became involved with the Fight Against Coercive Tactics Network, FactNet, which was the first database of psychologically coercive material ever created in the known universe. It was created by an incredible man called Bob Penny, who lived in Boulder, not so very far away from you, which is why I've been to Denver and to Boulder a couple of times. Bob was studied sociology at university for 9 years. And he told me that he then determined that this was a waste of time, got into Scientology and become a car mechanic. And he is one of the cleverest people I've ever met. He learned programming at a time when, we're talking, 91, 92, that he starts putting all of this material together. The internet has just been born, and he's worked out how to do this. He published Marjorie Wakefield's books privately, bound them individually, in these ring binder things, spiral binders. His wife was the mission holder at Denver, I believe. And he was just an incredible guy, but he also had multiple sclerosis. And so, Jerry Armstrong was, he and Lawrence Wollersheim had put FactNet together with the idea of, let's let people have this information. And Jerry then was going to be was the original president of FactNet. And Lawrence came to me, we didn't know each other before this time. He came to me and said, would I be the president of FactNet? And of course, because I'm very gullible, I said yes, not realizing that on the one hand, I didn't really make much of a contribution to FactNet. It was Lawrence and Bob. They did it. They deserve whatever kudos there is for that. And there's a lot of kudos for that. It's where, Arnie Lerner and so many other people who built databases, this was the first one. Now I think it's totally involved with climate studies. And, I got in on the edge of the Wollersheim case a little more. We'd been in touch. We'd just not met before that time. I became, for a year, I think I was the president of FactNet, a non-profit, which has paid me nothing. It seems to be a continuing theme, doesn't it?
Seems to be, yeah. Yeah, it seems to be.
And Scientology shifted its, it had gone after, it had created this new litigation field where a religion sues people for using its scriptures. I don't think anybody had thought of that one before. Then it was suing people for using its trade and service marks. And I remember going through the list of trade and service marks. I think there were 2,000.
There's a lot. There's a lot of them.
One of the marks is the happiest place on earth or something. Which
motto for flag.
Yeah, you can't say that now because we own it. And all of these peculiar magical symbols that have been used by different cults throughout the centuries are now trademarked, including the OT symbol, which is actually a symbol that had been used by a car company previously, which is one of the weird ones. Talbot Cars, I think it was. But they shifted from suing you for using the word Scientology, and that kind of stuff into this, they're always innovative, into this sort of, if you have our material in a hard drive, then, and FactNet were raided, Dennis Ehrlich.
This is Dennis Ehrlich's thing. This is how he was involved. Okay.
Yeah, who, I think his 4 children were left behind in Scientology, and he did a lot of work. He fought very hard through the 90s to help people and to get the truth out there. But you suddenly find this situation where people are coming and taking your computers away and everything that's on your hard drives. There was a raid in Sweden. And sometimes when you do these kind of oppressive, suppressive things to people, you can get a little bit of a retaliation. So in Sweden, what happened was that a member of parliament put the OT4 and OT5 materials into the parliamentary register, which meant that they no longer had copyright. And all you had to do was send $5 to the Swedish parliament and you could get the OT5 materials. Which probably have my handwriting on them somewhere. But
does it?
That might have happened.
Okay. Yeah, because that definitely is. Well, let's just say Scientology spent an awful lot of money to prevent exactly that kind of thing from happening.
Well, there's a piece by L. Ron Hubbard called "What Your Donations Buy," and the answer is harassment of people I don't like. Peculiarly, that issue actually was originally issued as "What Your Fees Buy," and it's one of the when Hugh Urban talks about the scholar talks about Scientology basically pretending to be a religion, doing all the things that make you look like a religion, then which had been hinted at by the pro-cult apologist Brian Wilson, who was not the Beach Boy, who was a professor of sociology at All Souls in Oxford, that they constructed the story that made them look like a religion, which is a fascinating thought.
It truly is. It's a nuanced conversation talking about whether Scientology is or isn't validly a religion, because you do have a base of people who truly do believe in this dogma. And so you go, well, isn't that good enough? And you kind of go, well, no, I mean, for me personally, intent matters, but especially at the top. But it's a nuanced conversation. It's not a black and white simple answer. Oh yeah, no, they're just not because they're not. There are arguments to be made for this on both sides that are good arguments. So I've gone down that hole myself a few times. I maintain it's not. I hold on to that as a statement, but I do understand why people think it's validly a religion.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right. You have to make the differentiation of according to who and according to where. Constitutionally in the US, once you've decided that a belief system is a religion for you, then it is. In sociological terms, and I've just mentioned him, and he's sitting down here. Brian noticed that he couldn't spell the name Brian.
Among many other things, I think I've given him the sharp end of my tongue a couple times.
Yeah, with this book, you've probably memorized it by now, but the 13th chapter, and how interesting it's chapter 13. I wonder if it's called Scientology, a Secularized Religion. So, and he in this has 20 points by which he assesses whether something is or isn't a religion, which are used now this is 1992, to determine whether a group is a new religious movement or not. And the point I'd like to make is Scientology a religion? According to these criteria, yes, it is. And this is a sociologist and an expert on religious movements at All Souls, which is the largest college at Oxford University, one of the most prestigious universities in the world. So let's accept what he says, that his criteria for religion are true, and therefore Scientology is a religion. And let's also point out, while we're about it, that the Manson family, by exactly the same criteria, is actually more of a religion because it ticks more of the boxes. That Daesh, ISIL, is a religion. That Shinrikyo, a terrorist organization that sought to kill 4 million people, is a religion. So the conversation is really, what do you mean by religion?
Yes, good point.
If the Aztecs ripping people's hearts out was a religion, then Scientology is definitely a religion,
Yes, and from that point of view, I get it. I get that. Totally get the argument.
Yeah, from the point, I agree with you. Intent is important. That because Hubbard was utterly cynical, and I think we found 4 sources for people who, in the late 1940s, Hubbard had, when I say we, Russell Miller and I, found 4 sources, people who had said that Hubbard had said to them, the best way to make $1 million is to found a religion. And that was countered by Scientology by saying, no, it was George Orwell who said that. Which is one of those, for me, it's mind warping, the thought that because somebody else had said something, it can never be repeated. Right,
or L. Ron Hubbard could never have repeated it. I find it hilarious that they would use some sort of historical irony, that they would use George Orwell of all people. That's funny to me, but yeah, I think I documented 3 of those in my book from your materials. So I knew there were at least 3. So yeah, Hubbard definitely said it. There's zero question about it.
And the 10th April 1953 letter to Helen O'Brien, and my copy came from Helen O'Brien, that's the provenance of it. She was the head of the Hubbard Association of Scientologists. She mounted the Philadelphia doctorate course in December 1953. And the letter to her, 10th April 1953, is very, very clear indeed. What do you think of the religion angle? So,
right.
you know, you know, but again, as L. Ron Hubbard said, and the most important thing L. Ron Hubbard said, and I keep saying it, is he explained in the Philadelphia Doctorate course that you have the pieces who must not know what the rules are, you have the players who know what the rules are, and you have the game maker who does not have to follow the rules. And he didn't. He most certainly didn't. Even when you talk to people who audited him, and I'd talked to a number, he would stop in the middle of a session and tell them to write something down or do something. He would not be the pre-clear where the auditor was in charge. You know, he broke the auditor's code. So, you know, he didn't have to. But unlike Freud never had a single session of psychoanalysis. Do you know that?
I think you mentioned that before.
Yeah, I'm going to keep
mentioning
that.
No, it's a good point. It's a good point.
There's a thought that Hubbard had some slight belief in what he was doing, you know.
Yeah,
and
he did. He absolutely did. And I think a belief curve rose over the years as it went on. And I think he was all in by 67.
Yeah.
Probably by 64, I think he was all in, because that's when we start seeing the confidential stuff and the solo auditing. And why would you be doing solo auditing if you didn't believe in this stuff? You know, it doesn't make any damn sense.
Yeah. And I mean, Jerry Armstrong pointed out to me when I first met him in June, July 84, that Hubbard was trying to cure himself.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
And when I went through, you know, you go through the things in Dianetics that it's meant to cure, and you get short-sightedness, but not long-sightedness. It's the first time I ever saw the word bursitis. You know, you wear a bursa that lubricates between bone and muscle. He had bursitis in his shoulder. Asthma, he had asthma. Terror stomach, as he called it. He supposedly had ulcers.
Exactly. All those things.
Yeah.
And it's obvious to see it because you see it in the affirmations.
Yeah, that he's talking about his perfect and lovely feet even there.
That's right. That's right.
What a weirdo.
So, yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, on the, you know, the legal things, I was sued for all sorts of things. And I made a terrible mistake. By 93, I was pretty much on top of it. And I had an intelligence chief who'd defected and was talking to me, who was then captured and sent off to Los Angeles under guard. And that was the sort of turning point. I thought that I was actually finally going to be able to do this. I never wanted to stop anybody practicing Scientology. I've never had any acrimony against any Scientologist. I would like to see those who have committed criminal offences and abused others in prison, but I don't wish them any harm. I didn't wish Hubbard any harm. I don't wish David Miscavige any harm. I just want them to stop harming other people. I want them to be contained from doing that. But that's, you know, it's put me in a, you know, I felt that I was starting to get somewhere. I had a search warrant for St. Hill called an Anton Pillar order. And unfortunately, one of the 5 spies that was operating against me knew about it. And I found out they knew about it. And it meant, because they'd boasted that they had my medical records. Now, that's a criminal offense where I live.
Here too. Total criminal violation.
I knew where they were keeping them. And in the sunroom, as it's called, St. Hill. But that was blown, and everything started going wrong at that point. I was engaged in this court case because I'd written 2 letters. I'd been asked to write 2 application letters to the Guardian's office. The second one was to start a celebrity centre in Manchester, which I'd been asked to do. And you write a life experience letter to them. And so, you know, here's my life history in its most intimate details, and they were showing these to people. Now, my complaint was that this breached confidentiality in that they were seeking to be my employer. So it breached a duty of trust there. They were my religion, they claimed, had been my religion, they claimed. So they were breaching a religious trust. They had been my counsellors, So they were breaching that trust also. And so this is what's called a breach of fiduciary duty. And I sued them. And that was the most foolish mistake I have ever made, because this is why you don't sue them, because they will then demand to have every document you have in your possession. And there was nothing I had a particular problem with there. But what they found was this clever loophole in the law, which was closed 6 months later, that because my lawyer was slow in producing material, and she was telling me I didn't need to worry about this, which was really foolish of her. But I didn't know the law as well as I know it now. And so we were late with discovery, with documents, and they put forward an affirmation. I don't make affidavits because I'm an agnostic. I make affirmations, not in the same way that Darren Hubbard did. I do have perfect and lovely feet, obviously, but it wasn't that kind of statement. My lawyer allowed me to sign a statement saying that I had now made full and complete discovery. And we should never have submitted that, because they then said, look, we've got your bank statements, but we haven't got your check stubs. Now, later, the loophole closed because it was said, providing 7 documents that all give the same evidence is not relevant. Lord Justice Wolfe closed that loophole. Too late for me. I lost a case. They'd hired a lawyer for a half-hour hearing. It cost me £16,250 to pay their lawyer for half an hour, which is about $20,000, because he was what's called a silk. He went on, in fact, to be the dean of the college where Brian Wilson used to be, All Souls in Oxford, the biggest Oxford college. So he was rewarded for his perfidy. So then that would go into every case that I was contumelious, that I had violated a court order. Contumacious or contumelious, you can have either word, which led them to then say, he's lied. And that's their statement about me, which no judge has actually said that I'm aware of, but I was contumelious. I had failed to produce my check stubs when they were demanded of me. And all they had to do was say that in any subsequent court case, and the judge wouldn't have anything to do with me, because it's something, so you don't get it, don't go down into a pit of snakes thinking that you're going to win. I pretty much knew quite early on, after 2 or 3 years, that I was going to lose. But I wanted to put enough material into the record so that in future, Scientology would come unstuck. And very fortunately, when the internet came along, my last act was to make sure that the 800-page intelligence pack went on the internet, that all of the documents, the Skipper letter, which we mentioned from 1938, all of the documents that I considered vital became publicly available through the offices of another person who I maybe shouldn't mention in this context, but so I'm not going to, but another stalwart human being who actually made, I lent him my documents, he made sure they reached the public, and they have been the foundation of much of the work since. Though, let's get honest about it, we should be putting up a blue plaque to James Phelan, who is the most important of all the people who've ever investigated Scientology, and his name is completely forgotten. But he's the guy in the 60s who actually went and found Hubbard's real college records and stuff like that, and kicked off the whole discussion about Hubbard's integrity. And you've got Alexander Mitchell in 68, and Paulette Cooper. Just a few people along the way who've been stupid enough to stand up against this tsunami of hatred that is the Church of Scientology. Well,
it really comes down to environments that they can control. That's what I'm sitting here thinking about right now. They can't control Twitter.
Yeah, gatekeeping is what it's being called these days. Information control, as Steve Hassan calls it. Gatekeeping. Mm-hmm. If somebody controls your information, there used to be the Papal Index. Right into the 1950s, there was an index of forbidden books published by the Catholic Church. And it was a sin to read one of these books come on, guys, you know.
I know. But more to the point with, why would legal be an arena that you would want to think not just twice, you want to think about 5 or 6 times before you start thinking about taking on the Church of Scientology in the legal arena. And the reason is because that's an environment they can actually control to a great degree. Not fully. Obviously, they've had their ass handed to them a few times by people who controlled that environment better. But there are so many rules, there are so many loopholes, there are so many pitfalls that the average person doesn't know anything about. And unfortunately, some lawyers don't know anything about either. You find out that there is no super lawyer who knows all the laws about everything.
And lawyers often believe in the honor of other lawyers. I had a situation where two of my lawyers said that they were going to actually take their own action against a Scientology lawyer because he had lied, and they could prove it, and he'd lied to win an action against me. He'd said that a document had not been filed on time when it had. But within about 2 weeks, these lawyers were no longer keen on doing anything about it because they'd had to think about it. And when you get into the amount of time, I mean, I spent 10 years working on the Lawley Scott case over the materials that, you know, the upper level materials. They were sued, and that was a very tortuous story. Robin Scott had kind of stood guard while Morick, Balmain and Ron Lawley went into the advanced organization in Copenhagen, said they were with the Religious Technology Center in their old SEAL uniforms, and Ron had grown a handlebar mustache so nobody would recognize him, demanded their OT materials and got them all, and then, you know, ran off with some of them. Robin Scott was basically, Jesse Prince comes back into this story. Jesse went and visited Robin and got him pretty much to make a confession. Robin, along the way, had been talked into going to visit a client in Sweden.
Now, this is when Jesse Prince was still in the church.
Yes, absolutely. This is
when
Jesse
Jesse's being the heavy here in this case.
Yeah, senior official of Scientology, right. And a very persuasive man. You know, this is the man who persuaded Diana Hubbard to give up her daughter at the age of, Roanne was 7 or 8 at the time. You know, and he's, you know, you've met him. He's the most charming human being.
Yeah, had him on my channel. Yeah, you can, you know, check out the interview. Absolutely.
Wonderful guy.
Yeah.
But yeah, Robin had been in this thing where, you know, somebody offered to pay him a lot of money to go to his Scottish Craig Advanced Ability Centre, but they couldn't get out at the moment. And would he fly out to Sweden to see them? And they'd booked the flight, and they booked the flight, and he flew to Copenhagen, where the police came on and arrested him. And I then had to spend a month bringing in documents. That's where I first got the Larry West documents in '84. We actually leased a photocopier, which cost us a small fortune at the time to get Robin out of prison. And I got these, you know, we couriered documents over at vast expense to us. I don't think we were ever paid any of it back. And Robin was, you know, his wrist was slapped and he was told he couldn't go back to Denmark for 5 years, and he'd committed industrial espionage. Then there was a fight between Morick, Balmain and Steve Bisbee. They were a couple. They ran the Advanced Ability Centre, East Grinstead. They were both dear friends of mine, but at that time they were both taking a little bit too much alcohol with their water. In fact, they weren't taking any water at all, to be honest. And one night, in the middle of the night, they got into a fight on the street outside the house of a woman called Nancy Carter, who worked for them. And Nancy came and told me, eventually. But what happened was that they got upset with, she came along, there were all these knowledge reports, there were all these independents. I'm at this point where I'm not really believing anymore, but I have the authority over people. I made the stupid mistake of appointing this guy to go and investigate what had happened with Stephen Morag, because I was on Nancy's side, right? And what he did was he collected nasty knowledge reports about Nancy from everybody he could and dumped them on Nancy. Now, Nancy was a woman in her 60s. She was a charming and delightful woman with a degree in English literature who'd interviewed Thomas Stearns Eliot, T.S. Eliot, as part of her a bachelor's degree, which I was tremendously impressed by. I was also a bit shocked that I'd known her for a year before I found this out, which told me that we'd not been talking about the right things, you know. But she then, of course, was picked up by Scientology and made a statement about everything that had happened in Denmark, because she knew about it all, because she was working with them. They then threw her out on the street. I did my best to make it okay, and I carried on seeing her for some time after that, and she was a friend, but she wanted nothing more to do with any kind of Scientology. She went back to the Anglican Church and felt a lot better, she said, than she had done for years. So that was good. But it meant they had material there. Jesse Prince got Robin Scott to cough up this statement. And I remember trying to persuade Robin at the time that there should be honour among thieves, and that he really, you know, he was coming down to East Grinstead and I was having to stop people from killing him, because that was how they felt about it. And they're not the only ones. I think Robin's had a few people want to do that over the years. Ultimately, that case took 10 years and they had no lawyers left. They had no money. They had me. And I put together a document pack which showed Scientology that if they went into court, then they were going to get all of this material exposed. And sure enough, the day the trial was, I stayed up all night writing the questions for Ron to ask the first witness, who was Sheila Chalef, their head of intelligence, I think. And I gave it to him at the door and he went off to court and he came back and he said they dropped the case. So after 10 years, you know, sadly, you know what's going to happen here, don't you? Mm-hmm. They didn't pay the bill. They owed me £37,500, and Robin Scott and Ron Lawley did not pay me a penny of that money. I went bankrupt because, you know, I couldn't meet my own litigation costs, and around it all went. But the point is that was 10 years. If you want to give your life to this, and I did give my life from the age of 19 when I got into Scientology through to now. A big chunk of my life, you know, there was 13 years where they weren't harassing me, and I came back going, they're going to start harassing me again, but I've got to come back with this message. You might not have escaped from Scientology yet. You might think that by not doing auditing, you're free and clear. You have to examine your thought processes. Now, I hope it doesn't upset him, but I'm going to mention Kerry Gleeson here. Kerry was Executive Director International after Bill Franks, I think. And I had the chance of interviewing him. He came and had dinner with me. It's the only time I ever met the man. I don't know if he's even still with us. And so we had dinner and I thought, now's the time. It's time to ask him what he thinks of Scientology. And I said, what do you think of Scientology? And he said, it's shit. And that was it. That was the interview. The point was that he was still making his living by selling the administrative technology of Scientology. And that contradiction I've seen all too many times, where people they believe that they're, you know, I used to always introduce myself on stage, there was a little while, where I'd say, I'm a recovering Scientologist, you know, to basically put it over that, which I don't think there's any of it left in me, apart from a few body thetans here and there, obviously, we've all got those. But you know, I don't think you could be less of a Scientologist than I am by now, because I've thought about all of it bit by bit, and you know, with the idea that I'd take it back. When I left, I kind of went, I reject it all, because I'm going to use it to think. So I must reject it all, get my thinking back. Then I'll accept back any bits of it that are valuable. There's nothing you can't get a better version of from somewhere else, frankly. It's mainly just creating euphoria in people. Very good indicators, make people high, make them happy. So let's wrap up with a, you know, I won't go into the murderous things that happened to me. I was wiped out in court. I was bankrupted through litigation costs. I lost a 5-bedroom house, which would now be worth more than £500,000. My mortgage was only 30,000. My life was, you know, my health was destroyed. It took years to come back from the stress of it, but it's all been and gone. So there was one case that I got pulled into, which was where they decided that they were going to do another deposition. So this must have been about 1994. And Kendrick Moxon himself, who was the head of Scientology's legal department and one of the 38 unindicted co-conspirators, along with Aaron Hubbard, in the Guardian's office cases in the United States, he came out personally. And this time I'd read the deposition rules. I already knew that we shouldn't be there, because under English law, the only time you can issue a deposition order is if somebody has refused to appear. I was perfectly willing to stay in a 5-star hotel in California and say nasty things on the witness stand about Scientology. They'd never asked me. I was charged £10,000 by an English court as a witness, which I think is, I've got 10 precedents in law in the US and England. I don't think there's anybody alive who has as many precedents. And that's one of them, because we went to court and said, they haven't summoned me to the California court. So under English law, and the judge decided that I was at fault and fined me the costs of the hearing, £10,000. So here I am in this deposition hearing, having gone down for another 10,000, this illegal deposition hearing, and I've got the deposition rules in front of me on the table. And I don't think it would damage his reputation to say now. On the second day, when we went in, the lawyer who was, the English lawyer who was sitting in the place of a judge, walked down the hall with me, out of earshot of Kendrick Moxon, and he turned to me and said, they're the most awful people, aren't they? Which is the impression of just one day of listening to Kendrick Moxon. And I was a bit naughty. I worked with Richard and Bonnie Woods, who were really close friends, and Bonnie and I would do intervention work. Richard's a great guy. He's a very clever guy too, but he wasn't involved with the interventions we did. He and Bonnie would later do a lot of work to help people. Richard is 6'4" and built. And so I said to him, under English law, you can have what's called a Mackenzie friend in the room with you. And so I brought him in. I said, sit just on the edge of Moxon's eye line and glare at him throughout the thing. And you could see Moxon kind of, this huge threatening character. You think Scientologists with OT powers would understand a little trick like that. But the thing I particularly remember is Moxon pulling out this thing saying, you say in your book that L. Ron Hubbard was not a blood brother of the Blackfoot Bikini Indians. I said, yes, because I do say that. And he said, well, here is a letter from a member of the tribal council of the Blackfoot Indians, Tree Many Feathers. And I said, he's not a member of the tribal council. And Moxon looked for the heading of the letter and realized he wasn't. I said, he's an eighth blood who devised his own ceremony without the authority of the Blackfoot Indians, because there are no records, and because, in fact, the Blackfoot, nor any Native American people ever made a blood brother. It's a Viking story that Hollywood picked up in the 30s. But, and he's going, stop, I didn't ask you that, And the lawyer's going, no, let him say it. And so I pointed out, Tree Many Feathers had just made this thing up. And we did hours and hours of this over 2 days. I don't remember how long. Now, the thing is, with the deposition, at the end, you sign it. And that makes it a legal, affirmed document. They never asked me to sign it. And that was, for me, that was an incredible idea, that I hadn't said one sentence that they could use in any way against me. They didn't even bother to get me to sign it. It was just a piece of harassment, basically.
Exactly.
And Moxon went off with his tail between his legs.
And that is not an off the wall claim. That's actually church policy, to use legal means to annoy and harass. And Hubbard said it's very easy.
The law can be used very easily to harass. Enough harassment on someone who is on the thin edge already should be enough to cause his professional decease. Is it decease or demise?
I think it's decease, actually. It's kind of an odd word there. And then right after that, of course, comes the ruin them utterly.
If possible, ruin them utterly.
That's right.
And professional. I think it might be demise because he's saying they won't.
I think actually, as I think about it, I think demise is the word.
Yeah. We'll go with that for the moment.
Yeah.
In 1955, the Scientologist, a manual on the dissemination of material, which, by the way, if there's anybody watching this who's ever been involved with Scientology, there are several things that you must read. One of them is this, the Scientologist manual. It was in the technical volumes, but you do the material that's on your courses. There's no, you don't sort of, instead of watching the television, well, maybe some people do. You don't, I actually did listen to L. Ron Hubbard lectures every now and then and things, but there are, this guy had, hypergraphia. He could not stop producing this material. And you suddenly find this great long, the Hubbard Manual of Justice is another thing that, putting a head on a pike and all of this. These are, available. They're not secret.
Except for the fact, actually, I'll take this moment to clue the audience in on the fact that for the last many years, it was shortly after I left that I first heard this happening, that within the churches of Scientology around the world now, you cannot find the technical volumes, the red books, and the green books full of all of the policies that are all in chronological order. That's how those books were put together. And they are the complete sum of Hubbard's technical writings and policy writings, at least as applicable to that level of church. They're not even there anymore. They have purposefully ordered them out of the qualifications libraries, out of the course rooms. They only have the course packs and all of the newly authorized coming down from Miscavige books and materials and dictionaries. And it's still a wealth of material, but it's not the complete material by any stretch of the imagination. And that's no coincidence that exists that way, because it prevents exactly the advice that John's giving right now from being able to be carried out. You have to go on the internet to find this stuff now.
Yeah. And I mean, people have talked about, alterations to the material that's happened. And I must say that the only things that I've checked that have been pointed out like that are where, an issue was originally, a pronoun that should have had a capital letter, like father, had there are changes of that kind. I've not seen any significant changes. I'm not saying they haven't happened. I'm saying I haven't seen them. But what has happened is gatekeeping, taking the information away. And what used to be, commonly available, as you say, has now been, withdrawn from public view. And if you happen to be, a communicating member of the Church of Scientology, the International Association of Scientologists, that is a question to ask. Why is the material not available? And, I'm gonna ask about a misunderstood word. You know that people who have misunderstood words commit overts. They commit sins or crimes against other people. So it's very important not to give people misunderstood words. You may be one of the few people who knows the answer to this question. Why is the word squirrel used in Scientology? What does it denote? Where did it come from?
Well, according to Hubbard, it comes from it denotes offbeat practices, altered Scientology.
That's what it means. What's its etymology? Why does he use the word squirrel to describe such a person? I'm sorry to put you on the spot.
No, you got me on the spot here, and I don't know that I know the answer to the question as such. I just know how Hubbard described it, and he said that they are, they're kind of like squirrels. They run around looking for nuts and stuff. I mean, it's this kind of an idea, but I don't know if I invented that or if Hubbard actually wrote that.
What Hubbard originally said is that they are in a squirrel cage chasing their own tails. Now, in Britain, that's meaningless. We have no such expression. We call them hamster wheels.
Well, see, so do we. And until Hubbard said that, I'd never thought of a squirrel wheel.
They shouldn't be called. Yeah, well, it's the idea that they'll chase their own tails. They'll get nowhere.
Yeah. Even coming out of the church, I call it the hamster wheel to nowhere. I don't call it the squirrel wheel to nowhere.
Squirrel cage to nowhere.
Yeah. That's probably why.
But it's just this, when you get into the craziness, this thought that Hubbard was actually all the time giving people words and telling them, you will attack me if I give you words that you don't understand. And even the word that is used by Scientologists for somebody who practices Scientology without a license is misunderstood.
Good point.
Yeah.
Very
so
good point.
maybe the reason that Scientologists feel they have to be so hateful towards those of us who no longer share their beliefs is because of their misunderstood word. And really, we should be called hamsters.
Something to keep in mind. We're all a bunch of hamsters out here. Well, listen, I want to return briefly to this point I was making earlier, because I don't know if I finished the thought or not. Maybe I did. I just wanted to.
This is like Alice, where you didn't write your name on the slate at the beginning of the trial, and you can't remember who you are anymore.
Yeah. The thing about controlling the environment, I think this is an important point. It's a framing. It's just a way of looking at it. But, why is Scientology so powerful in the legal arena? Well, it's because they pay a lot of money to control that environment. And they are better at controlling it than most other people by witness. I mean, they get, like I said, they got their ass handed to them. When you get very competent and detail-oriented representation, then you can hope for outcomes like that. When you get slipshod, average, regular, like anything from bottom barrel to average level representation, you're going to lose. That's just what's going to happen, because they're going to hire people better. They're going to hire more people, first off. They're going to have more brains attacking the problem from more angles. They are not shy about using the money that they have to do this. And they'll just keep, and they will persevere long beyond the ability of most regular mortals to do so, because they got the money to, and they really, and they don't have anything better to do with it. So, just want to throw that out there. As far as, like, I've said this before, but it's worth repeating that, it's not just some blasé. Why don't you guys just do a class action? Why don't you guys just get a lawyer? It's kind of like, why don't you just go see a therapist? It's like, there's a lot more going on to this than you think. If you think it's all just that easy to deal with this stuff, it's not. So,
and I think what happened was, if you look at the, I published a piece of blue sky, what's now Let's Sell These People a Piece of Blue Sky, in 1990. So the 30th anniversary of publication has just gone by. The next book to be published in the English language was Inside Scientology by Janet Reitman. And for 21 years, no book was published in English. And that was because of the control that they had through litigation. Now, what happened that changed that was the time suit. Rich Behar's Scientology, the Cult of Greed, and I named a little booklet in homage to that for people who've not been involved in Scientology, who probably won't be, or don't know anything about it, probably won't be watched. But if you want to explain it, to somebody, nice little slim volume, there you go. But that was an homage to Rich Behar, because they stood up. Time wouldn't stop. I'm told it cost $20 million to fight time, and Scientology lost. And at that point, David Miscavige had what they call a cognition. Now, that's a word to the rest of the world. It means a thought, but to them, it means an epiphany or revelation. And that was, suing and harassing people is not really getting us where we want to go. We are a laughingstock, So the policy changed. They don't use the law. They are the most litigious organization in the history of the world. There's no competition. With the IRS case in 1993, they dropped 3,000 court cases in a single day, right? Those were just cases involving IRS people. So that was their whole thing. We will pour out thousands and thousands of suits and cause the professional demise or decease or whatever it was, and ruin people utterly. And as somebody who was ruined utterly, I can say that's a part of the technology that does work, Scientology does have that kind of power. When you've got $1 billion and you know the paper mountain technique, which is that you just keep filing more stuff in court and more stuff in court. I mean, Paulette Cooper had a situation where things would be filed in different states for her to appear at the same time, which is not physically possible. I think Jerry ended up with 48 contempt orders or something, where all he'd done was exercise his free speech, the constitutional right. But you can sign away your free speech, it would appear, your freedom of speech. So, yeah, you are going and tangling with a very dangerous monster if you get into this. But they can be beaten, and Laura Swallersheim is probably right that the power of Scientology won't go away until they are properly beaten in the courts. I had a case, they sued my friend Bonnie Woods for libel because she was handing out a little leaflet. They were basically for the first time, opened a little shop in East Grinstead. 59, they arrived 4 miles away. It takes them until, the 1990s before they dare. And it was firebombed at one point. It was awful, the feeling of the locals towards it. But it meant they put a street recruiter out, with a clipboard. And so the local churches wanted to do something together because they couldn't think of anything else. I mean, to be honest, they wouldn't even meet together because the Catholic guy wouldn't be in the same room with the Baptists, so I had to go to 2 separate meetings of the churches together in East Grinstead, which I used to call the churches untogether. But they wanted something they could do. And I said, look, just get 2 of your parishioners, get this guy with a clipboard, go up to him, hand him this leaflet and say, we're going to be with you. Everybody that you talk to today, we're going to hand this leaflet. Now, the secret was, and I don't think they'll sue me for it now, that I wrote the leaflet. Bonnie didn't write it. She got sued. Bonnie and Richard got sued for it. I wrote a leaflet that they could edit as they wished. So I wrote a draft. And it began 75 million years ago in this sector of the galaxy. Prince Xenu exploded the souls of 178 billion or what have you people in volcanoes on the planet Earth. This may sound like the work of a science fiction writer, and it is. The point of doing that was that what Bonnie called taking the bait back into the nest. That the only street recruiters are people who are new, because the longer you're in Scientology, the less you're able to communicate with people, basically. So, you go out there with it. What would you most like to be? What would you most like to do? Would you like a free personality test where we ask you 200 questions, the answers to which are, many of them, rather personal? And now the guy's getting this leaflet, and what he does is he goes in and he gives it to the person, and he says, this has got this nonsense here. And the person has either done OT3 or not. But sooner or later, somebody who's done OT3 sees this and says, sorry, the recruiter now has to pay double for all their auditing because they have to have a class 8. So you've just done the recruiter a favor. They can't get any more auditing. They won't get any auditing. And they mustn't ever say this, and they must be told it's not true. But we closed down the Dianetic Bookshop and the Chichester Mission in a matter of weeks using this technique. I've tried to export it many times, but Bonnie even went over to LA and was actually handing out leaflets not so very long, a few years ago. Bless her.
What happened with that suit? That they sued her?
Well, they sued her.
This was in England, right? That they're doing this?
Yeah.
Yeah.
By this time, I know from the Laity case what you do. And she, in fact, got the same document set that I'd used for Laity. And exactly the same thing happened on the steps of the court. They dropped the case. They gave her $55,000 pounds, about $65,000. They made an apology in open court for what they had said about her because she'd countersued. And they signed a document which can only be presented if there is litigation, allowing Bonnie and Richard Woods to say anything they like about Scientology, which is why, if you look very carefully at a copy of this book here, you'll see that it's published by Richard Woods. Anything I say about Scientology in the UK is published by Richard Woods because he can't be sued.
Wow.
I can't believe that David Miscavige allowed that to happen, but he did, guys.
Wow. One almost wonders if that was done and a signed deal before he even knew about it somehow. But regardless, that's an amazing outcome, and that is really good news.
That material was then moved to the Mary Johnston case, and I'm not even sure that or was it Mary Johnston, I'm not sure, in Ireland, and that was the precedent in law in Ireland. I'm not even sure that she knows that that's where her case came from, that I designed this case and you just keep exporting it. So there is a way to defeat them, but you need somebody who is absolutely expert on Scientology. And unless you've got a tremendous amount of money, I'm not that person anymore because I don't do this kind of thing. So go to Chris.
Yeah. I ain't that guy either. But yeah, I get it. The point being that, I'm all, of course, speaking, when I talk about taking on Scientology legally and this kind of thing, I'm talking about me. I'm talking about, us. I'm talking about regular folk, right? You got money, you got the will to do it. I mean, fine. But yeah, have a strategy that's going to work. Have people who actually understand it, because so far, unfortunately, from what I've seen, most of these the lawyers that I've heard or seen who had anything to do with this stuff were way in over their head before they even realized what was going on, and they get their ass handed to them, and that's not great.
But I'm going to make a public protest here that there are several cases that have occurred in the US where the lawyers didn't even send me an email. They were so convinced that they knew what they were doing, and those cases have been lost, at great cost, because it's like the media people who come along and my first TV thing, BBC Panorama, back in 1986, and the journalist comes along and says it's about the money because he's read 2 pages in Forbes magazine and he knows what it's about. Only once in my life as a TV producer, and I've done a couple of hundred media pieces over the years. I don't do very much anymore, but only once as a TV producer come to me and said, John, what do you think we ought to do? That's why I got annoyed about Leah Remini, and I apologized to her and to Mike Rinder, but they never asked me. You've been around this a long time. You've got a lot of information, and you seem reasonably smart. Do you have any ideas that might be helpful? People don't ask. And that's, I think, for ex-Scientologists, it's to some extent because Scientology is a way of making narcissists. It's a way of making people believe that they're the cleverest person in the world, and they're not. I am.
Well, I think when it comes to that, this word gets bandied about quite a bit and this kind of thing. But I mean, let's face it, we're all self-centered.
That doesn't mean narcissistic at all.
No, it doesn't. But it's often, but that word gets bandied about. It gets thrown around to explain egotistical, self-centered behavior when it is not narcissism. Narcissism is I don't think people really get like how far out down the spectrum that is. It's not your neighbor who just doesn't like something that you're wearing, says something bad to you or something, and says they're all that. That's not narcissism. Narcissism is way deeper than that.
And at the moment, it's a subject I'm engaging with. I'm looking at Eric Fromm's work. Fromm was the first person to use the term psychiatrically malignant narcissist in about 1961, and he published a book in 64 about it. And I'm very interested by the misdefinitions. He talks about being egotistical and that being a failing, and that when it gets worse is being narcissistic, and that when it becomes something that's done against other people becomes malignant narcissism. And you can add to that what the great, I have it right here. I've just finished reading the Losing Reality by Robert J. Lifton, which revisits some of the essential material in his work and then has some commentary. But he, in talking about Donald Trump, says you're not dealing with a narcissist per se, you're dealing with a solipsist. Now, this is the highest grade. This is a person for whom nobody else really exists. We're all creatures of imagination. And I'm not qualified to say anything about Donald Trump in that regard. But when somebody said Donald Trump is a clone of L. Ron Hubbard, then in those terms, yes, L. Ron Hubbard was a solipsist. There's a story called One Was Stubborn that he wrote in the 40s about this situation. And he basically, as with any sociopath, you don't care about other people's feelings because you don't feel them. You know, maybe your mirror neurons aren't firing or something. I'm not totally convinced by that argument yet. But you don't feel anything. If somebody who's in the room with you hurts themselves, you know, they bang their thumb or something, you will go, yeah. Not the solipsist, not the narcissist, not the psychopath. They don't feel those feelings. They have a different construction and perception of the world. But you are so right. The word narcissist is being bandied about crazily at the moment. I mean, a couple of years ago, our good friend Pete Griffiths was accused by my friend John Dykman of being a narcissist. And it's like, no, Pete's a show off. He's an exhibitionist. He's a performer. And I personally love him for that. You know, his flamboyant dress and manner. I think it's great. But there is no ounce of cruelty in that man. But so you could be a narcissist in that sense, like Elton John or David Bowie or, you know, whoever. Morrissey, maybe a different matter altogether, you know, but who knows what he is. But, you know, I think a lot of performers become that. Mick Jagger, whoever, a lot of performers become that. Adele, some younger people than those as well. When they go on stage, you know, as Bernard Fowler said, in having performed as a singer with the Rolling Stones for 30 years now and almost being unknown, even though he sings lead on stage with them, he said, when you're driving to the gig with them, they're human beings. When you get on the stage, they're gods. And they use that. But I don't think there's anything malignant. In fact, I think the Rolling Stones have probably contributed a great deal to positive culture by pointing out some of the faults, like the lovely song about neocons, for example, a few years ago, and Mother's Little Helper, and, you know, Get Off My... So many insightful things about, you know, yet Mick Jagger does seem to be somewhat self-obsessed, especially according to Keith Richards. So, you know, right. There are gradations, and even there, it's the extent to which you recognize there are other people, the extent to which you try to help other people, and the extent to which you try and control other people to your own benefit. And Ron Hubbard was, in that sense, narcissistic. But I think he was a lot worse than that too, you know.
Absolutely. That's actually fascinating. And I'm going to have to check out that latest book from Lifton because I have not seen that.
Oh, it's fantastic. Yeah, Losing Reality, Robert J. Lifton.
Yeah, I'm going to check that out.
Really, it kind of it's a refresher course in the works of Robert J. Lifton. And for me, it was just like, why am I bothering to say anything? This guy has said it all in such detail. And it's, well, because... you know, maybe I'll be able to tell the story a different way and, you know, I'll be able to get it over to a different audience, you know.
Well, exactly. Plus, Lifton's not exactly doing weekly podcasts and that sort of thing. So, you know, we got to get the information out there. And
there is a great interview on Steve Hassan's site about Losing Reality with Robert J. Lifton. So,
excellent. Cool.
But now, you know, here we are. We're coming towards the end, and I meant to, people tell me, look, shout about your YouTube channel.
Well, yeah, like, okay, good. So let's hear it.
Well, we're still there. We're still putting out 3 pieces at least a week. We've talked about Scientology in some detail. We've talked about Nuka Dampa tradition. I have a particular thing about fake Buddhism. I'm having a go at Triratna. Generally, we've got, you know, my interest, as you know, is prevention. Let's get it over to the next generation, that they don't have to belong to any one of the 25,000 authoritarian groups out there. You know, it's great that we say the Jehovah's Witnesses and the Moonies and this group and that group, but it's a way of being, and you can recognize human predators, you can recognize their techniques, and if we could just save 1% of the people from the horrors that we had to experience, then it would be worthwhile. And so, you know, my channel is about prevention. It's also about information about authoritarian groups and discussion about that. And it's also about my family, because, you know, I have a 15-year-old boy who can play pretty much everything Jimi Hendrix played, pretty much everything Jimmy Page played. I hate him because when I was 15, I'd have liked nothing more. I have, you know, my other son, Sam, who appears with me regularly, he's studying psychology, he's 17 now, and makes paper sculpture and does stuff like that. And we want to show something of a healthy family dynamic on the channel too. You know, I've had a couple of people who've written in and told me that Sam really doesn't say enough. You know, so from now on, it's his show. We also, of course, you now have L. Ron Hubbard commenting on your channel, I notice.
Oh yeah, oh yeah.
I've actually, I started looking at this and I've got some nutcase who thinks he's L. Ron Hubbard, and now I realise he's actually this really clever man who is quite positive and friendly. The guy who's calling himself Donald Trump, I'm having a bit more trouble with.
Yeah, exactly. Well, do check out Jon's channel, and again, the link will be below, as it has been in our other podcasts on with Jon. Just go around and watch some of the little 5-minute things on there. You know, get a taste of it and subscribe. Exactly. Come on, guys, hit that subscribe button and the little bell. Make sure you get the notifications when the new videos come up. So cool, man. Wow, we have covered a lot of territory, huh?
Yeah, we've sewed up the legal situation. Now we've only got another 73 topics. And we'll be done.
All right, well, we will wrap up this week. But Jon, thanks again, man. I always appreciate your time and the knowledge that you want to share. And I think my viewers certainly seem to indicate that they do as well in the comments and stuff. So thanks, man.
It's always a pleasure. And actually, it seems to be more of a pleasure every time. And that's a good thing about a friendship, eh?
Awesome. Yeah, I agree. I really do. Yeah. All right, man. Folks, any questions, comments, feedback out there, don't be shy about leaving it. Put it in the comment section below or at sensiblyspeaking.com. I want to hear from you. I want to hear your criticism, even if you think, you know, we're getting something wrong. Leave it in there. Just don't insult us at the same time, and we'll try to do this, return the favor and not insult you when we reply. So on that note, again, stay safe. Okay, these are dangerous times. We are living in interesting times. Unfortunately, I think most of us wish we weren't. But this is the world, and this is how it is right now. So we have to deal with that. And like I said, just follow the directions. Get accurate instructions on what to do out there. Okay, the information is out there. The governments, despite their bumbling and fumbling and individual problems, they really are trying to solve this thing. And I think if we look at all of their efforts with pessimism and cynicism, we might be losing. I think we want to, you know, be a bit more optimistic about this whole thing and be part of the solution, not part of the problem. So that all being said, folks, I'll see you next week. Thanks so much for coming around, and bye-bye.